If an artist debuts with 5 consecutive songs at the top of the charts, where would you expect his story to go? Superstar. Legend. A career that simply cannot go wrong. But this story is not about how Clint Black succeeded. It is about what was taken from him at the very moment of that victory. Because from that day on, he was no longer allowed to fail. Not a single misstep. Not a single experiment. Not one chance to collapse and rise again the way other artists are allowed to. When Nashville crowned Clint Black the new standard of traditional country, it also, unknowingly, locked him inside an invisible frame where every step that followed was expected to replicate a moment so perfect there was no room left for error. Clint Black did not fade away because he grew weaker. He stepped out of the spotlight because there was no way to continue forward without breaking the image that had just been built around him. This is not a story of collapse. It is a story about the cost of winning too early and about a man slowly imprisoned by his own success. And to understand how that happened, we have to go back much further, to where the belief that you must get it right from the very beginning first took shape. Clint Black was born in 1962 in New Jersey, but the man he would become was shaped in Texas, a land that does not encourage dreaming and offers even less room for weakness. His childhood did not unfold in safety. Losing his father at an early age left a silence without explanation, forcing Clint to learn how to stand on his own before he ever had time to be afraid. In that environment, no one taught him to chase the spotlight. They taught work, they taught responsibility, and they taught that mistakes always come with a very real cost. Music entered Clint's life not as a romantic escape, but as something solid to hold on to. Guitars, fiddles, the daily hum of country stories, a world where everything had structure, where beginnings and endings were clear, where right and wrong were sharply defined. It was here that a psychological pattern took shape. Clint came to believe that if he maintained enough control, if he did everything correctly from the very start, life would leave no room for sudden collapse. His original dream was not fame. It was more modest and far more dangerous, to become someone who would never have to start over. In the early 1980s, Clint Black entered music not through an open door, but through narrow paths. Texas bars, low stages, dim yellow lights, and crowds louder than the singing itself. He wrote his own songs, played his own shows, drove his music from door to door, asking it to be heard. There was no producer behind him, no hitmaker watching his back, only a guitar, a voice, and everyday stories that had to prove their own worth. Those years were anything but romantic. Some nights he played to just a handful of people who weren't listening. At times, music couldn't pay the bills, forcing Clint to take on physical labor just to survive. Every rejection ended the same way. He packed his songs into the car, drove to the next venue, and played again. The rhythm of that life became exhausting in its repetition. Rejection, play again, disappointment, play again. There was no such thing as a strategic retreat. There was only one choice: keep going for as long as you could endure. It was on those nighttime roads that Clint Black's belief hardened. If his music was tight enough, correct enough, disciplined enough, then sooner or later there would be a moment that could not be denied. Clint Black did not try to shock or twist himself into something different just to be noticed. He believed that what was right, if held long enough, would open its own door. What he didn't know was this: that belief was both what kept him going and what quietly prepared the greatest trap of his life. Those quiet years did not lead straight to a miracle. They only forged a man disciplined enough not to break when the real moment finally arrived. In 1989, Clint Black released his debut album, Killin' Time. There was no loud campaign, no shocking first strike, only songs written with such precision that they left no emotional cracks exposed. And then something rare happened. One by one, the songs climbed to #1 on the country charts, 5 times in a row. Not a single hit leading the way, but a chain of dominance that forced Nashville to stop and look directly at him. Awards followed quickly. Country music associations began calling Clint Black a breakthrough discovery. But more important than trophies or chart positions was the way the industry began to define him as a standard. That halo did not form by accident. It was the result of a perfect resonance between one individual and his moment in time. By the late 1980s, country music was tired. Audiences had grown accustomed to polish, but they were beginning to lose trust. They wanted stories that sounded like real life, melodies with roots, a storyteller who didn't strain to be noticed. Clint Black stepped directly into that space. An artist who wrote most of his own songs, who did not showcase technique, who did not try to reinvent the genre by breaking tradition, but by executing tradition with almost cold precision. His music did not shock. It felt reliable. And at a moment when country music was searching for its identity, that reliability became more powerful than any trick or spectacle. Because of this, Clint Black's success was not seen as a journey still unfolding, but as a finished model, a benchmark, a measure by which others would be weighed, and by which he himself would be measured. From that moment on, the halo did more than illuminate Clint Black. It confined him. Because when you are declared right, from the very beginning, every step that follows is no longer allowed to fall out of rhythm. Success stops being a reward and becomes an obligation, one that must be repeated. And it is precisely here, at the peak, when everything seems to have been fully granted, that another pressure begins to form. Quietly, persistently, without a name. Once fame had taken shape, love was no longer a purely safe refuge. It became a space that had to be protected. Clint Black met Lisa Hartman at a moment when his career was already on an irreversible trajectory. The spotlight was no longer something distant. It stood just outside the door. And so his marriage did not begin with fantasy, but with unspoken agreements to keep private life out of the machinery of schedules, image, and public expectation. But fame does not knock. It intrudes. Endless touring, fragmented rhythms of life, decisions measured in weeks, sometimes in minutes. Family existed in the gaps between flights, between performances, between promises of next time. There was no explosive tragedy, only gradual erosion, a pressure that made no noise but never relented. Clint Black responded in a way entirely consistent with who he was. He tightened control. He did not turn his private life into promotional material. He did not borrow from marriage to extend his halo. What was unnecessary for the music he kept to himself, and paid for it with a quiet kind of loneliness. The decision to have a child came late, not from emotional hesitation, but from a deeper fear, the fear of absence. The fear of becoming a father who existed only on magazine covers. When his daughter was born, those fears became clearer than any song he had ever written, because children do not care about titles, charts, or perfection. They recognize only who is present and who is not. From that point on, Clint Black's philosophy of life revealed itself most clearly off stage. He chose to slow down. He chose performances he could control. He chose presence over the repetition of victory. Not because fame had faded, but because fame had come too close. Close enough to threaten what was most fragile. The public saw a reserved artist. His family saw a man measuring every hour with care. At that intersection, absence became most visible, not on stage, but in private life, where no moment can ever be done again. And it is here, when the spotlight is no longer at the center, that something else begins to take shape. Not a collapse, but an undercurrent. Psychological fractures accumulating long enough to force decisions no one else can see. As private life slowly became a space where presence had to be reclaimed, pressure no longer lived in tour schedules or stage lights. It began to move inward. The choices made to protect family, slowing the pace, controlling time, guarding privacy, also tightened the boundaries of creative space. And at that intersection, a quiet contradiction took shape. For Clint Black, discipline had once been the anchor that kept him upright. But when discipline became the demand to endlessly repeat a standard already declared perfect, it changed roles from a tool of survival into psychological weight. Each new project was no longer an exploration, but a test of whether he could remain right the way he had been the first time. Country music, too, was shifting. The market began to demand faster spectacle, packaged identities, attention-grabbing turns. In that landscape, cold precision, the very thing that had built his halo, slowly lost its central place. No one pushed Clint. Blackout. He was set aside, politely, quietly. And that quiet was the cruelest part. No rival to fight, no fall to be reborn from. Inside, the question repeated itself with growing clarity. Remain unchanged in order to survive, or change in order to keep living. Each choice carried its own cost. Staying the same meant a refined form of isolation. Changing meant breaking the image that had sustained him for a decade. The storm did not scream. It eroded. It eroded the feeling of forward movement. It eroded the right to try and to fail as a growing human being. And when that pressure accumulated long enough, it did not need a dramatic event to conclude. It required only quiet decisions made behind closed doors, decisions that allowed absence to take shape, not on stage, but in the rhythm of everyday life. The most significant decisions rarely happen in front of a camera. They take place when there is no audience, no pressure to explain, and no one counting the moment you quietly step away. For Clint Black, collapse did not take the form of a fall. There was no retirement announcement, no door slammed shut, only a sequence of small choices, repeated long enough to alter the entire trajectory of a career. He began to choose selectively, choosing performances, choosing projects, choosing when to appear. What had once been central, the relentless cycle of touring and releases, gradually moved to the margins. Not because he lacked the ability to continue, but because continuing in the same way meant erasing the private life he had just managed to reclaim. To the public, it looked like a disappearance that was hard to name. There were no signs of failure, so there was no comeback narrative. There was no scandal, so no apology was expected. The absence was not loud enough to become news, but it lasted long enough to become real. Inside, it was a cold decision, to leave the race before it forced him to choose between family and identity. Maintaining the image of a standard or continuing to live as a changing human being, the two could not coexist. So Clint Black did not leave in the way people expected. He slowed down, allowing distance to form on its own. He reduced his presence, so pressure could no longer find a place to attach itself. And in that contraction, a truth emerged. Sometimes stepping away from the center is not defeat, but a refusal to keep playing a game that no longer has room for who you are. If there was a collapse, it lives here. Not on the charts, but in the cost paid for the right to choose. Once distance had been created, the spotlight no longer offered cover. There was no longer the counted rhythm of tour schedules to push everything faster than emotion. No applause to fill the questions left unanswered. Life returned to its true tempo, slow, exposed, and impossible to evade. For Clint Black, the years that followed were not a disappearance, but a period of confrontation. Confrontation with himself, once fame no longer served as a shield. Confrontation with the emptiness of someone who had traveled very far, yet was no longer certain where he was headed. Healing did not arrive as a clear decision. It unfolded as a process of reordering, learning to live with unhurried mornings, with days that required no proof of worth. Music returned to its original place, no longer a race, but a place to breathe. There he could slow down, try smaller things, and accept that not every step needed to be seen. Family, at this stage, became both an anchor and a final test. Without the spotlight, every absence became more visible. But it was also then that presence gained real weight. Ordinary moments, complete dinners, time spent with his child, began to compensate for the years that had passed. Not to erase the scars, but to learn how to carry them. Growing in silence did not mean surrender. It meant accepting new limits without denying oneself. It meant understanding that some fractures do not need to be repaired in order to disappear. They only need to be acknowledged so they no longer dictate every choice. Those years of feeling our way forward did not produce a climax. They produced depth. And within that depth, a man began to live on, without noise, without escape, but steadier in the truth of his own decisions. After the years of feeling his way forward, the question was no longer how to return to the center. The question was whether returning was necessary at all. For Clint Black, continuation did not arrive as a carefully staged revival. He reappeared at a different pace, slower, more selective, more deliberate. Performances were no longer about proving anything. They existed because music still needed to be played, and because he still wanted to be there when everything felt aligned. Public expectations gradually slipped from his shoulders. Clint Black no longer chased charts or a comeback narrative. The public role, the thing that once governed every decision, was no longer the center of his life. He appeared when he wanted to. He stepped back when he needed to. And he no longer felt indebted to the market's rhythm. As a result, his present life took on a new order. Health came before schedules. Time was redistributed so nothing had to be sacrificed. Music returned to its original role, a conversation, not a race. Recent activities, selective performances, right-sized projects, were not meant to generate noise, but to keep the current of life moving in a sustainable way. The most profound change lay in his philosophy of living. Clint Black no longer viewed a career as a straight line that must be climbed endlessly. He accepted the curve, forward at times, paused at others, so long as he did not lose himself. For him, maturity meant knowing when to stay, when change was necessary, and when to leave before circumstances forced the exit. This continuation is not loud, but it has direction. And in that direction, The story does not close with a new peak, but with a rare balance. The kind that appears only after one has gone far enough to understand what is worth holding on to. When looking back at Clint Black's journey, numbers are not what linger the longest. But if you know how to listen, they tell a very clear story. Just months after his arrival, the country music industry was forced to acknowledge him with its earliest honors for a new artist. Major associations called Clint Black's name not because he was loud, but because he arrived at precisely the right moment, with a standard that felt remarkably complete. The CMA Award for New Artist of the Year and the ACM Honor for Top New Male Vocalist were not merely congratulations, they were markers, confirming that traditional country had just rediscovered a dependable pillar. What matters, though, is that Clint Black did not stop at being labeled a phenomenon. When the ACM later awarded him Male Vocalist of the Year, it was no longer generosity toward a newcomer, but recognition of a craft that had proven its strength. He did not step onto the award stage as a temporary victor. He stood there as an artist who had demonstrated that discipline and creative autonomy still had a place in the marketplace. Years later, when a Grammy came to Clint Black through a collaborative recording, the award was no longer tied to charts or sales figures. It arrived as a belated acknowledgement that he belonged to the long current of country music, where artistic value is measured by endurance and respect for tradition. And then there were honors that required no fireworks. Becoming a member of the Grand Ole Opry was not an explosive moment, but a settling into place. There, Clint Black was positioned in the same room as those who no longer needed to prove anything, because what they had done had already become part of history. Clint Black's legacy, therefore, does not rest on how many trophies he collected. It rests on the standard those trophies represent. He leaves behind a quiet message for the generations that follow, that you can reach the peak without surrendering control of your music, that you can be recognized without becoming the loudest version of yourself, and that you can step away from the center when the center no longer reflects who you truly are. If awards are milestones, then legacy is the road others are able to walk. And in Clint Black's case, what remains after fame is not prolonged applause, but a silent standard, one that still stands firm long after the spotlight has shifted elsewhere. Clint Black's story does not end with a full stop. It pauses, in a quiet space where nothing needs to be proven, where winning and losing no longer require definition. A man who traveled very far, who reached the summit earlier than most, and then chose to keep living at a pace that allowed him to remain present with himself. Not everyone has the courage to slow down when the world is still used to calling your name through the glory of the past. Not everyone is willing to accept that a complete life sometimes does not require another peak. And perhaps the question is not meant only for Clint Black. If you were in that position, when success arrived early, when every eye expected you to become more, would you keep climbing higher or choose a different way to stay? If this story left you with a thought, share it in the comments. Press like if you felt a sense of connection, and subscribe to continue walking with us through stories like this.